Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our webinar, ICER's Value Assessment Framework, an overview of the 2020 Value Framework. My name is Marc Boutin, and I'm the CEO of the National Health Council. The National Health Council was formed by patient organizations for patient organizations 100 years ago. The CEOs of the patient groups control our governance and policy making. We have representatives from all stakeholders in the health ecosystem represented in membership, including the biopharmaceutical, device, diagnostic, payer, provider, researcher, and family caregiving perspectives. Next slide. We know that many of our members engage with ICER regularly, and many have also submitted comments during ICER's framework open comment period. Next slide. Thus, the purpose of today's webinar is to provide our members with the opportunity to learn about updates and changes to ICER's 2020-2023 updated value assessment framework, including a focus on patient engagement opportunities. Next slide. As many of you know, value assessment is an area that the NHC has been involved with for many years. We recently released a number of new resources, including new online modules on topics related to health economics, a glossary, and a guide to help patient groups develop comments on value assessment. We encourage everyone to visit our website and learn more about these resources. Next slide. Before we start the webinar, we'd like to remind attendees that they are muted for the duration of the webinar. We will have time for questions at the end. Please submit your questions via the WebEx chat function. And now I'd like to give a brief introduction of our two guest speakers. First, Dr. Steven Pearson is the founder and president of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, ICER, an independent nonprofit organization that evaluates evidence on the value of medical tests, treatments, and delivery system innovations to encourage collaborative efforts to improve patient care and control costs. Sarah Emond has nearly 20 years of experience in the business and policy of healthcare. Sarah leads the strategic planning and operations of ICER as Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. In that role, she is responsible for overseeing ICER's public programs, communications, operations, and finance. Steve and Sarah, I now turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Marc. And my thanks go out to Marc, to Eleanor, to everybody at National Health Council, and to many of you on the phone with whom we have worked before. I hope you are all safe and your families are doing well. I know it's a complicated time. So it's a really nice thing that Marc and others were able to set this up. I'm going to take the lead and walk you through the highlights of the current value assessment framework. I will focus more on the kind of updates or changes, I guess, but I'll give a little bit of background, enough to hopefully kind of see it in the big picture. So we're going to hand the slides over to me. If you could give me control of the slide advancing. If not, you can go ahead and advance it. I'm sure you'd love to stare at our beautiful faces for the whole hour, but we'll try to do something else.
Steve, control over the slides.
Well, it's not giving me control, so, oh, wait, maybe it did. Okay, sorry, they may be a little bit sluggish. Okay, so launching right in, this is an overview of our current iteration of the Value Assessment Framework. Okay, you know who I am already. All right, just a brief background, because I know not everybody is going to know as much as others about ICER. So as Marc mentioned, we're an independent nonprofit health technology assessment group. We started as an academic research project at Harvard Medical School and moved to become an independent not-for-profit in 2013. From day one, over 13 years ago, we've been developing publicly available value assessment reports And we also convene regional independent groups of doctors, methods experts, patient and public representatives as part of independent appraisal committees so that we can really have hopefully as transparent a discussion with as much opportunity for input into the overall process of looking at questions of evidence and value. So our funding sources are updated on our website as a pie chart. You'll see that the majority of our funding, I should say, comes from nonprofit foundations. The biggest one of those is the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, but we also get funding from California Healthcare Foundation, Commonwealth Foundation, National Institute for Healthcare Management, and others. We do take funding directly from both health plans and provider groups and manufacturers in those greenish segments. That is kind of firewalled over to support our policy summit activities each year and does not support our research projects. So the conceptual elements of our value assessment framework are going to be shown here in a picture, and then I'll kind of break down each of the components and again talk a bit about what's new. So we think it's really important to, the goal of a value framework should be hopefully to make, again, as explicit and transparent as you can what value looks like when we're trying to put together a report and host a public discussion around it. And in a way, we've thought of trying to say that we're doing this all, we're trying to pull together information and have public discussion to meet a goal that we really do believe that is a shared goal among all stakeholders. That is, we all want fair prices linked to fair access and future innovation. Now, the information that we think that policymakers need to achieve that can also kind of be broken down into two general buckets. One is a longer-term look at value for money being spent on different services, and the other is the short-term affordability. It's great when those two things line up, but they don't always. Sometimes we have things that are great long-term value for money, but that might still be a short-term affordability concern. So our reports certainly include both, but we recognize that they are distinct. Now, within long-term value for money, and I'll spend most of my time here, it's obviously a complex idea. Value to whom? Value in what way? Well, we think that in general we can help it by dividing it into these kind of conceptual areas. One is a very explicit look at the comparative clinical effectiveness information. We also do an incremental long-term cost-effectiveness analysis based largely on that clinical effectiveness information. But there's also an important part of our reports and of our public meetings that's focused on what we call other benefits or disadvantages. Those are things, and I'll talk a bit about those because that's one of the changes in our recent update, that are meant to capture important elements of value that we all think that policymakers should be thinking about, but that might not be in any way captured in the clinical research trials or other sources of quote-unquote evidence that we might have. And contextual considerations is an important but kind of intangible bucket in some ways because it includes ethical values that we might have around how much we would prioritize care for the most severely ill, or for younger folks versus older folks, or are there other contextual issues around innovation, first chances at any cure, that kind of thing. So that's the conceptual backdrop to the way that our value framework works. For the short-term affordability, obviously there's kind of a simpler approach to talk about, which is potential budget impact on the health system. What you do with that information is obviously a more complicated matter. So I'm going to jump into some of the things that I hope are clear from that value framework, but may not be completely. And these are the following. One is we've always really wanted to emphasize that overall, this is an approach to anchor our discussions around value in the long term. Our healthcare system, which is obviously dominated by corporations and is not a kind of public service, it's very easy for it to focus on short-term budget aspects, including return on investment or current profits or whatever. So we've wanted our work to try to make sure that the entire system think more about long-term aspects of value. It is clearly anchored in the evidence on comparative clinical effectiveness. Another piece that is sometimes harder to capture is how eclectic we are and open to accepting multiple forms of evidence. Just because we say comparative clinical effectiveness does not mean that we are rooted in a worldview in which randomized controlled trials are the only way to learn anything about a new test or treatment or anything else. So we've always been very open to try to understand everything we can using multiple forms of evidence. We also recognize in our approach that what matters to patients is really not limited to what is in that clinical evidence. And patients know that, doctors know that, but it's very easy for the system to forget that as things get pushed through FDA and kind of payers and others start to look at it. So it's important to us that we always keep that in mind. And as I mentioned before, our conceptual framework really clearly acknowledges the role that contextual considerations need to play in overall value judgments, as well as including information on potential budget impact, which if left out, we think can actually do a disservice to the transparency that we need to force the system towards over time. All right, so let me jump to some of those buckets and drill down a little bit. So again, just to be really clear about our look at comparative clinical effectiveness, we do take a systematic review of evidence. We start in our timeline with a scoping phase, that's what we call it, in which we're working with patient groups and clinical experts and the manufacturers to really kind of help us know what we don't know. What do patients view as important to them? What does clinical value, money value, what do all those things look like to patients? What's the diversity in the experience that patients have in their course across the journey? And we need to know all of that before we really kind of get our feet settled and start to look at the evidence, because it'll help us know what's more important or what's not there and where we have to make special efforts, et cetera. So we obviously start with the publicly available material. We're increasingly looking to generate new data from patients and caregivers that might fill in some of the gaps, even during the time of our review process. And we're increasingly able to tap into in-confidence material from manufacturers to make sure that we are getting the best current evidence while we're doing our reviews. So I can't state it perhaps more often enough that we're looking for evidence from multiple sources, not just RCTs. In our methods, we have to make some kind of comparison. It could be to placebo, but what patients and clinicians and obviously policymakers also want to know, to the extent possible, is how does a new treatment compare to other existing treatments? So we do direct comparisons, certainly where the evidence is available, but we often have to do indirect comparisons through ways that can do a better job of adjusting for the clinical trial evidence when two treatments haven't been put formally head-to-head in a single trial. That's called network meta-analysis. Throughout all of that, we're very sensitive, and it starts with our scoping conversations. We want to know what are the subgroups, what are special kind of niches, if you will, of the patients who might be treated, where the risks might be different, the benefits might be different. How can we understand the diversity and of the subgroups and the heterogeneity of the effects of treatment across those subgroups? We want to look for evidence to support those ideas, and wherever possible, make sure that our models, our cost-effectiveness models, are sensitive to the idea of subgroups. We do use an overall rating of our evidence of comparative clinical effectiveness, and it's meant to kind of combine our judgments of the strength of the evidence and the magnitude of the overall health benefit. And I'm not going to show you that picture because it would take too much time to run through. But it's a kind of a grade, if you will, for the body of evidence. And it's, again, a starting point for discussion. It's our best way to frame an overall look, if you will, at the certainty that we have based on the existing evidence and how much benefit a treatment seems to give across the population. So let me shift to another bucket within the long-term value for money, and that's incremental cost effectiveness. This, as you probably know, is based on kind of taking short-term data and using computer models to kind of spin it out long-term. So we're looking at the long-term clinical outcomes and costs for different treatment options. And kind of intuitively, you can think of this as a pathway of care. If you take treatment A, you go down one pathway where you'll have certain likelihoods of side effects or benefits, and those will have certain effects on doctor's visits or hospitalizations, certain effects on quality of life and length of life. And you compare that whole pathway using one treatment versus a whole pathway using a different one. Now, the cost that we include in these models is important. We're not just looking at, let's say if we're comparing two drugs, we're not just looking at the effect of drug costs. We're really looking at costs across the entire healthcare system. And as I'll mention briefly, we also look at costs outside the healthcare system insofar as treatments may affect things like education or the criminal justice system, or more often and more concretely in some ways, the effects on people's ability to return to work or to have higher work function. So those are the costs. When we're looking at the health outcomes, we start with the data that are in the trials or from the other data that we have. And they're often linked to things like functional improvement. Does the treatment help someone walk better? Or does it help prevent a stroke? Does it help reduce pain? All of those are kinds of the measures that we get. And we can also find out, hopefully, from trials whether there is a chance or demonstrated extension of life from a treatment. Now, the functional improvements and other things, ultimately, if we're trying to kind of compare them across treatments, we also want to kind of create a common, if you will, measure of improvement in quality of life. And so to do that, you have to sum, if you will, kind of translate the functional outcomes or other outcomes that are measured into quality of life. And then if you're going to compare the overall health effects of a treatment, you need to have some way to summarize how the length of life and quality of life kind of sum up, if you will. And so we use the kind of standard, if you will, age-old in some ways, measure quality-adjusted life years. And we've also introduced a variant of another way to look at cost effectiveness that we call equal value of life years gained. And because this is relatively new, the EVLYG, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on it on this call. So it's complementary to the QALY, and it arises because what we wanted to do is to still capture what I've written here, the differential effects of treatments on the length of life and quality of life. So the EVLYG still captures the changes in whether one drug has better side effect profile than another. It still captures the improvements in quality of life of, let's say, fewer seizures, whatever it might be. But if the treatment extends life, and a lot of drugs actually don't, and if they do, just a little bit. But if the treatment extends life, the EVLYG makes sure that any extended life is weighted, if you will, by the quality of life score as if it was a full quality of health. One way to put that in layman's term is that basically, if a drug extends life by 1 day, 1 day of extra life is valued the same, no matter at what quality of life. To put that into stark terms, if we had a drug that treated patients who were comatose and on a ventilator, and it didn't help them wake up or get off the ventilator, but it extended their life for some reason, that time on that ventilator, unconscious, would be weighted the same as if the drug was extending life at full health. What it does in that way is it eliminates any risk that treatments that do extend life at a lower function or lower quality of life will receive a lower value-based price benchmark. And so you can have a result based on the equal value of a life year gained. And again, you can be absolutely sure that that's not happening, that the treatment is not going to be given a lower value in terms of the price that it would be assigned as a value-based price if it's extending life at a quote-unquote lower function or lower quality of life. The downside, if you were to use this all by itself, you could, but the downside is that it could override the patient's own valuation overall, that time spent at a much higher function is worth more than extended life at a lower function. So we know from lots of studies of surveys of patients that, especially hypothetically, if they have a very severe condition and you ask them, would you rather be cured for 3 years or kept exactly the same for 10 years, they might unanimously say we'd take the 3 years at a cure. The equal value of a life year gained, in a sense, hardwires the length of life extension as being the same, kind of the same price would be attached to the drug that did that. So that's why it's important to use in a complementary fashion to the QALY. And we have language that's kind of been part of what we do for a while, but as part of our update, we can highlight it, that makes sure that we believe that policymakers really should be looking at both results, understanding when they're different. Usually the cost per QALY and the cost per EV-LYG are very, very similar, often the exact same. But if they're different, people should understand that, and they should think about what implications that might mean for the broader kind of judgment of value that we put into our work. All right. So I'm going to go really quickly through this so we have time, lots of time for questions. But some of you might not have seen this very simple schematic on how we turn kind of cost effectiveness into a suggested value-based price. So relatively quickly, let me say that assume that that blue dot in the middle here is our best current treatment for heart failure. And, versus no treatment, it has a certain cost and it has a certain effectiveness, overall effectiveness as measured in added QALYs or added equal value LYGs. So let's say we had a new treatment, the yellow dot here, and it's more effective and it has a higher cost. And we have, in rapid order, another more treatment that's even more effective and even more costly. So then you can start to ask some questions. And this is partly what cost effectiveness does. It kind of forces you to ask the question, wow, well, I can see that first treatment, the first new treatment gives me, a pretty good increase in my effectiveness, and it's, it's more expensive. The second one gives me a little bit more effectiveness, and it's a lot more expensive. So what do we do with that? Well, patients would certainly probably want the most effective treatment at a similar out-of-pocket cost. Cost effectiveness kind of asks the question of, is there a price at which that more effective one would be a quote-unquote fair price, given how much better it is, which isn't that much better. And this is where the idea of a threshold. We use ranges because we know that there's no one perfect single threshold that should dominate and should be a kind of single line in the sand for any decision. And so a value-based price takes the price at which we currently have these two new treatments. And you can see that we've made the decision that the added price for the first treatment lies below that cost-effectiveness threshold range, and therefore is a quote-unquote reasonable value at that price, whereas the second new treatment isn't. And we would say conceptually that we need that price to come down below that threshold. Now we have a price that's still higher than the first new treatment, but it's somehow scaled proportionately in the way that we think would represent a fair alignment of price. So how do we come up with that scale? Where does that come from? Where does the threshold come from? Well, again, there are different ways to look at this over decades of work between health economists, ethicists, policymakers, clinicians. Some have looked at it as a societal willingness to pay. How much should society be willing to pay for additional health, if we're going to figure out how much it's willing to pay for an additional QALY, let's say, because that's the way it's frequently scaled. Well, the World Health Organization, the American College of Cardiology, and many others started saying, well, let's scale it to the wealth of the society by looking at per capita GDP, and they kind of threw out a rough 1 to 3 times per capita GDP. When you do more sophisticated research more recently, health economists in the U.S. Are favoring a willingness to pay threshold around 100,000, and that's based on surveys of individuals kind of scaled up, if you will, to the national level. Another kind of paradigmatically different way to think about it, though, is called the opportunity cost for the health system. The basic idea there is that if we're going to spend something new, some dollars on something new to improve health here for the patients we can see, are we losing more health elsewhere by not spending the money there? And it's easier when you have a single budget for a single large healthcare system to do that. And in the UK, when they did that work, it led to a threshold of around $15,000 per QALY. That work is now being extended to the US, And it's very interesting research that is tying the impact of new spending on premiums, the increase in premiums on the risk of people losing or dropping insurance, and the associated impact on mortality of losing health insurance. And it's been done, I think, in a very sophisticated way, and really kind of interestingly, because it's taking a completely different tack. It comes up with a result of $104,000 per QALY, almost the exact same number as an approach using a completely different look at how we would think about what we, quote unquote, should pay for additional health. So ICER, what do we do with this? Well, we give a broader range in our reports. We've kind of standardized that now to give results at 50, 100, 150, and 200,000 per QALY and per EVLYG. And when we put out our quote-unquote health, we've called them value-based price benchmarks. We're going to be calling them health benefit price benchmarks now. We're using, in a sense, towards the upper end, higher than you will the academic research is suggesting around 100. Because our work is frequently thought of as a ceiling price below which competition and other things could still function, we've decided to keep it at 100 to 150,000 per QALY and per EVLYG in the work that we put out. All right. So let me come back to this slide, because now I'm going to focus on these areas where there's one of the important changes in our update for the next few years. I'm going to talk about other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations. So historically, we've always had some form of discussion about these at our public meetings, but about, gosh, maybe 5 years ago, we started having a formal section in our report that split these out. And then the last time we did a value assessment kind of framework update, we had a very specific vote on each item so that we could make more concrete and tangible for policymakers. And we've taken that another step based on our experience and lots of feedback from you all on the phone often and others to create a voting structure that we think will give even more kind of tangible guidance to policymakers about how to think about these and their importance in thinking overall about value. So now we've grouped the potential other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations in a voting structure where our independent appraisal committees will be asked to vote 1, which suggests lower value, and I'll show you why later, 2, which is kind of an intermediate default, if you will, and 3, a vote there would suggest that that potential other benefit or contextual consideration would suggest higher value. So I'm not going to run through each of these rows which indicate a particular benefit or contextual consideration. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So the first one is about uncertainty, which is kind of actually a contextual consideration around the evidence itself. So a 1 would mean that the uncertainty or there's uncertainty or overly favorable model assumptions in the cost-effectiveness model that creates significant risk that our base case cost-effectiveness estimates are too optimistic. So this is a judgment that will be made by our independent appraisal committees, not by us, obviously. A 3 vote would be that the uncertainty or there is uncertainty or overly unfavorable model assumptions that create significant risk that the base case cost-effectiveness estimates are too pessimistic. So you can see how it's kind of a mini Likert scale that we think will be better than the kind of dichotomous voting that we've had on these. And we've also refashioned some of these votes, I think, to capture some important ideas. We've always asked about productivity. We include that in what we call a modified societal part of our work. But again, here they'll be asking to vote. It will not have a significant impact on returning to work and or overall productivity, or it will. Now, we don't have a quantitative thing around what is significant because I think that's a value judgment, and patients will testify. We'll have information about that we've heard from them already in our report. But that's a judgment that we think it's important. But having it on this list and having it voted on, again, is meant to really create a concrete template for consideration of the important elements of value that are just maybe not in the clinical trial evidence itself. Another one here is a new one, a brand new one at the bottom. The intervention offers no special advantages to patients by virtue of presenting an option with a notably different balance or timing of risks or benefits. Let me jump to number 3. If you voted 3 on that, you feel that the intervention offers a special advantage to patients just by virtue of having an option now with a notably different balance or timing of risks and benefits. What that might mean is that the treatment overall, if you're measuring it in length of life and quality of life and you take a long-term perspective, maybe it's exactly the same as another existing treatment. Maybe it's even a little bit worse, but maybe it provides a different balance or timing. So it might give you a higher chance of being alive at 5 years with a higher risk of dying in the first 6 months. Now, again, that's trying to meet the idea that there is value in having a choice for patients who might have very different feelings about how they want to take risks with their care options. So this is one of the areas in which there's no way to capture that, if you will, quote unquote, just from a clinical trial. It's a value judgment, but we think it's important to capture that and to make sure that payers and other policymakers are thinking about it as they are translating evidence into their policies. All right, sensitive to time, I have a couple more slides and then I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk about our patient engagement program. So another thing that this has again been always kind of what we preach, if you will, but we're trying to be more concrete, because the last thing we want is for people to feel like those potential other benefits and contextual considerations are nice to have but don't have to have. You know, we can ignore that kind of stuff because there's a lot of importance there. And so we want to make sure that, again, everybody who thinks about how to use cost effectiveness realizes that cost effectiveness is not the only part of a value judgment about any treatment. And so even if you're considering our range, which within, you know, which is a pretty broad range for many of the treatments when you come down to the price that we're suggesting, that the application of these potential other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations should really be used to kind of push your thinking one direction or the other. And that's why it is so hard, I think, to use any kind of single tool to come up with one bright line answer. Judgments of value depend, and they depend on things that aren't in the clinical trials but need to be taken seriously. And so we are trying again in our value assessment framework update to continue to move further. Believe me, we have always thought about whether there are ways to make a calculation to somehow translate a potential other benefit or a contextual consideration into a specifically different price recommendation. But the methods of doing that often open up a risk for unintended consequences of winners and losers that people would not feel comfortable with. And so with a lot of continued thought over the years, and this goes along with international benchmarks as well, we've really chosen not to try to move it into that realm and make it as clear as possible that these should be tangibly taken into consideration, but not ascribed a specific point system to them. All right, a few modifications that we've done around potential cures that were timed to coincide with our overall value assessment framework update. We call them high-impact single or short-term therapies, or SSTs, not just to come up with another new acronym, but because we recognize that it wasn't just cures, but sometimes a treatment that would just halt a very serious condition from getting worse that we might want to think about differently. So why should we have any modification for our assessment methods? One is that if you have it, let's just call it a potential cure for now though, they really are highly valued by everybody. We had a meeting once and I said, what is the most different thing about these kinds of treatments? And a doctor raised his hand and said, because we have to give them. We, all of us, manufacturers, payers, clinicians, patients, this has to be done. It's also, I mean, imagine once we have a treatment for coronavirus, it may not even be a cure, but there will be almost kind of this implicit societal ethical mandate to use it. Now, if it's a single or short-term therapy, you have increased uncertainty over the long-term benefits and risks, and might have unrecoverable costs if you're paying for it up front. And that often creates a specific challenge to the traditional way of doing cost-effectiveness modeling. So I mentioned how we're looking at eligible treatments. It's one-time treatments that are potentially curative, short-term treatments that might offer other forms of transformative benefits. And what we're doing with those going forward is that we're really just kind of adding more context to the modeling results. So one is we're going to be very formal about offering optimistic and conservative benefit scenarios because we found that there's just a lot of pressure on that issue. What if it works only for the 2 years that we have the data on it? But what if it works for the entire lifetime? How different are those two results when we're looking at the cost effectiveness? We're going to be doing what are called threshold analyses. At the current price, let's say it does have a price in the market, how long would it have to work for it to meet a cost effectiveness threshold range? That's another way of kind of helping people think about whether it seems reasonable or not. And then, especially for certain treatments that might represent cures of chronic, very expensive conditions, we feel it's important to offer some hypothetical, what we call shared savings analyses. What this means is that if we have a cure for hemophilia and the lifetime health care costs of a patient with hemophilia might be $25 million, we're not going to say that all of that money gets folded back and wrapped up into a fair price, quote unquote, for a cure. We think there are important ethical and societal reasons to think about sharing any cost offsets from a potential cure. So we're going to do hypothetical analyses. We'll do it the normal way, if you will, but we'll also have a model in which 50% of those cost offsets are, if you will, captured by the innovator and 50 are retained by the health system and society. We'll do another one where you can only kind of count the cost offsets up to $150,000 per year in coming up with a fair value-based price for a drug. All right, a few additional key changes in our framework. One is that we are taking that general idea that we've always considered subgroups and heterogeneity, and one way to make sure that we and everybody else is aware of those is to create a new bright and shiny black and white section in our reports focused on just that. We are going to take our societal perspective that looks at productivity and other factors when we can and promote that to co-base case whenever the impact of care outside the health system is substantial in proportion to the health effects. We were doing that for ultra-rare disorders. We are now expanding that to all treatments under the circumstances that I mentioned. Just a couple things on the voting. We've had kind of situations sometimes that came up when we didn't quite know the price or the estimated net price, it wasn't yet through FDA approval. We're going to go ahead and have a vote on the long-term value for money using our estimated net price. We think that's important to kind of continue to make sure that the potential other benefits and contextual considerations are woven into thinking about value. And even if the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio is sky high, we're going to move to voting on the long-term value for money no matter what. We think that we can just, it may seem kind of superfluous to take a vote if the cost per QALY is $1 million. It's highly unlikely that anybody on our appraisal committee is going to vote that that's reasonable value, but we're going to go ahead and take a vote. All right, I apologize if that took too long. I'm going to skip this slide because I think most of you are aware that we're going to be doing a new approach to our report updates to have a 12-month checkup, and we're doing a pilot on accelerated approval drugs in which we'll be using a formal relationship with a real-world evidence company to generate our own kind of analyses to help inform that assessment as an update. With that, though, I want to hand it over to Sarah so that she can tell you more about our new patient engagement program that's a part of our Value Assessment Framework update. Sarah?
Thank you, Steve. And my thanks to everyone at NHC for the opportunity to talk with all of you today. It will not come as a surprise to anyone on this phone call how excited I am about this change in our value assessment framework and how we've been able to formalize what we've been doing with patient engagement. Before I do that, just a reminder of our process and how long it takes us to do a review. And if you look through a bunch of these inputs or time points, you can see how important the stakeholder engagement piece is in each of these. Talking to patient groups, clinical experts before we even put out a draft scope. Having another opportunity once we've designed our draft research questions to hear how those need to be changed, improved based on feedback from stakeholders, including patients. The 8 to 20, the over 15 weeks we spend doing the actual draft report itself and opportunities to look at the model analysis plan, the preliminary results from our model, and getting feedback from stakeholders there. And then, of course, the very public evidence report, draft evidence report, public comment period and revision, culminating in that public meeting where patients and clinical experts stay at the center, literally, of the room, talking to our independent panels about the lived experience, what it's like to treat people with this condition, to give that important context to conversations about evidence, about cost effectiveness. And then finally, the report goes up with a summary of that rich discussion and the policy recommendations that we're putting forth that are grounded in evidence. Next slide. And what we did through our, the comments that we received on our draft proposed changes to the value assessment framework, the notes we've all been taking as I've been in meetings with many of you, you've met with Steve, the program managers that many of you have gotten to know through a particular review. There were things that we were doing and things that we knew we could do better that we wanted to put down in writing as our patient engagement program. One of these is to solidify our commitment to talk to groups regularly on a more formal timeline before we've even started a review. So for some groups where it's very likely we'll be taking a look at drugs in their space on some sort of periodic basis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, we're going to have an annual meeting. We need to hear what's happening from your perspective. We want to hear about what you're feeling and thinking about the new therapies on the horizon, what's happening with access issues, what are the things that we need to know as we think about doing a new update to a class review. We will also be doing more attempts to give some early guidance to groups not in these major therapeutic class areas when we have some certainty, even if it's slight, that we might look at a drug in a new disease area. We owe it to the patient groups in that disease area to have a conversation before we've even announced the review. And so you have our commitment that we will do that when feasible, when we have a high certainty or even a low certainty of going forward with a review. The other thing we've done, but we're making sure it's very clear is a key part of the scoping, is when we're doing the topic announcement, we're working with the different patient groups to identify those outcomes that are most important to patients and their families. And there are opportunities here to try to identify how patient groups really can contribute data to the economic model. And that sort of flows into the next bullet, which is there may be opportunities to generate evidence through surveys or other avenues to get some real-world evidence that will help us in developing the economic model and running the economic model so that we can reflect outcomes that matter to patients when they haven't been captured in the clinical trial. We have been doing this, and we're excited to make this more formal, that we want to have a formal debrief with the patient groups after every review. I know many of you on the call have helped us and participated in these. We make adjustments to the work we do based on that feedback. So please know how important that is to us, that after all of the time you have given us throughout the 8-month process to invite you for one more hour phone call has been incredibly valuable and really helps the next patient groups that will be involved in an ICER review. This last one is probably one of the ones I'm most excited about, actually the last two. When we hear from patients how disappointed they are that there are very few outcomes that matter to them and their families in an ICER report, and that's usually tied to the fact that they weren't captured in a clinical trial. We share that angst, we share that frustration, and we're now inviting patient groups to co-write a letter with us to the FDA and other important stakeholders to signal what those data were that were missing. What were those outcomes that were important? How can we get them part of the drug development process so that we can stop hearing that frustration from patients? And the last item, you're going to know who she is very soon. She's starting in mid-April, but I am thrilled to tell everybody that we've been able to recruit an exceptional candidate to be ICER's inaugural Vice President for Patient Engagement. And I talked to a lot of you about this when we were looking at candidates and drafting the job description. We've identified, we've sort of pictured this role in two important ways. One is to be there with all of you when we're allowed to be together in the room again, to hear what's on your minds, to hear how things are going, to be the one person you can go to hear what's happening at ICER, to share some feedback, frustration, whatever it may be. The other important role this person will play is an internal ombudsperson. They're going to be in the meetings with us, whether we're talking about methodology, a change to process, or how we're running a meeting, and their job is to make sure that everything stays focused on how it's going to impact patients and their families. Can't wait to tell you more about her. That should be coming in the coming weeks. And in the last slide here, before we open it up for questions, you can click through for me, Steve. I think that we just wanted to make sure we had this opportunity to reiterate that at the core of why we do what we do is we do believe fair deliberation can help improve access for patients, costs in the healthcare system, and get us to that grand bargain. And we believe fair deliberation means we have respect for everyone throughout the process. We're very clear and inclusive in our procedures, and you may not like the final decision, but we're going to be very transparent about what those decisions are. And again, my thanks to NHC for the opportunity to talk with all of you today. We're really excited for the questions.
Thank you both, Steve and Sarah. We really appreciate this. And Sarah, I just want to apologize. I was focusing on making sure I pronounced your last name, Emond, correctly, and unfortunately I did not. So apologies for that. While we're waiting, unfortunately I've got one of those last names that people get wrong all the time. While we're waiting for questions, we have a few questions for you. And first, I would love to hear your thoughts on what the National Health Council could do to help get the patient groups ready for these updates.
That's a great question.
Do you want me to? Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Sarah, go ahead. No, please go ahead, Sarah.
Well, it was funny. I actually had a conversation with Elizabeth and Eleanor not that long ago. I was frantically scribbling because I was so excited that some of the priorities of the National Health Council were overlapping with some of these priorities we have in our patient engagement program, specifically around the generation of real-world evidence and how we can be facilitating that in a way that's going to help value assessment, that's going to help drug development. And so I see a ton of opportunity there. And I think that the work that NHC has been doing to highlight the importance of patient-focused drug development and honestly, the pressure that's being put on the FDA from the patient community to make sure this is front and center is really going to pay dividends to the richness of the data that we have and the way that we're able to update, do new reports, and to make sure that that patient-centeredness comes through in the value assessment. So I know, because Elizabeth and Eleanor are always wonderfully responsive when we call them and ask them for time to be brainstorming on this, and the working group that you guys have on value assessment is going to be honestly a place we go to often to make sure that as we do these updates, as we do these letters to the FDA, that we benefit from NHC's expertise there.
And Mark, the short answer, that's a good answer, Sarah. I totally agree. And the only thing I would add is you'll hear, and obviously, you know, we try to keep our ear open and have lots of conversations, but you'll hear it in a different way. You'll hear what people don't know or don't understand about what we're doing. And more webinars like this or whatever other opportunity. I mean, I hate to call it training because that sounds top down, but like if we heard from you there are a lot of people who just do not understand that business about the EVLYG or cost effectiveness, or they just don't understand, actually they don't understand how evidence is used by P&T committees inside payers today. We hear different things about how it's used or not used. So anyway, you would have a really good finger on the pulse of where patients are feeling uncertainty or anxiety about who we are, what we're doing, and opportunities for us to, in some way, support them. And there may be, you know, actually that idea of the co-written letter, the offer, right? So it's not like, hey, you got to do this with us. The offer, hey, you want to co-write something to the FDA, that came directly from a patient group. And we hope they'll keep coming to us. But if they want to come through you, and you can be a kind of a warehouse of ideas of things that we could continue to offer as part of our patient engagement program, that would be a great help to us.
I appreciate that, and I'm sure we will stay in touch as we move forward. Steve, I'd be curious if you could provide more comments about your public comment periods, especially in this current time with COVID-19 and some of the challenges patient groups are having.
You mean about our current, how we're trying to manage COVID-19, or something more broad?
More broad in terms of ICER's public comment periods, and in particular in the current environment with COVID-19 impacting that.
Oh, well, obviously everybody's trying to figure out what reasonable looks like under COVID-19, and we, like everybody else, we said, okay, we'll just do everything virtual, and then, well, no, that's not going to be enough even, because what we started to sense pretty quickly was, and we know, I mean, it's not easy to feel responsible engaging with us on behalf of your organization, because it seems like there's all these documents you're supposed to read and all this stuff we ask you for input on. So we know that that takes time, and everybody's time and bandwidth now is focused on taking care of the patients in their under their kind of care, if you will, whether you're an individual clinician or if you're a patient group. There are a lot of things going on that you need to make job one. So so we understood that we would have to put some kind of pause into our processes where we could extend things. So we've tried to make the best one-off decisions we can on how to do that. More broadly, we kind of have this interesting, I think, approach to patient comment, quote unquote, or to comment, public comment. We'd like to feel like if there's anything that we get in the formal public comment letter that we haven't heard already, we've not done something right, because we want to be in touch with everybody, obviously the key groups in particular, at the beginning, where we hear a lot of stuff during scoping. We want to be in touch with them as the draft report is being, kind of evolved. Now, we know that there might be some standard concerns, if you will, or kind of pre-existing and post-existing concerns about cost effectiveness or the risk for access or whatever that's not going to change, and needs to come out in a public letter. But anyway, we really focus on trying to make sure that we're hearing things before even the public comment phase. But we want to keep public comment because there could be, unknown individuals, unknown individual patients or smaller groups or whatever that we haven't been in contact with. So we take those phases very seriously, but we also view them as opportunities to make sure that we learn as much as we can even before they are open.
Thank you. And I'll address this question to both you, Steve, and Sarah. Will ICER create some sort of resource that would describe the elements or themes of patient input that are impactful to ICER? And then related to that, I know earlier you talked about directing or collaborating with the patient community to direct the FDA to gather data that was useful from a patient perspective, and we applaud that. Is there an opportunity to work with us to identify what data would be useful to ICER? So I think there's two resource questions there from a patient perspective.
I'll go quickly, and then Sarah, you can follow up. I think the first could be kind of job one of our new VP of patient engagement, because we've thought about it, and in some ways we know that patient groups often learn a lot from talking to other patient groups that have worked through an ICER process before to kind of have an idea of what they can say. Because what pains us the most is when patients have something important to tell us and they feel like it should somehow be visible in the economic model, let's say, and it can't be, not because, sometimes it's because there's no data, but sometimes it's just because that's not a feature that goes into an economic model. It has to be a contextual issue or a potential other benefit. So I think we do need to continue to figure out better materials to share with patient groups way before they might get involved in an ICER review. We've had a document that we've looked at recently, and it's okay. I think it was based on HTA international kind of models, but we want to keep improving that. And then the second question was around the FDA letter. Was it like what kinds of data?
Well, we think it's a great opportunity to collect the data for FDA, but maybe there's an opportunity to start to identify what data would be of value to ICER, because some of the data you use may be different.
Well, it should converge. I mean, ultimately, we really do almost always say if we had what the patients say matters most to them directly, that would be ideal. Instead, we have to do some kind of crosswalk from what the FDA and the company decided to use. So there's a lot of convergence on that. So maybe I'm not catching your question.
No, I think you are correct. There is some convergence, but there's from a patient perspective, there's substantial amounts of data that get to the outcomes that matter that have virtually no or very limited impact on the regulatory decision making. And FDA has been clear about that as well. So I think there are probably elements of data that would be useful in a health economic analysis that would not be useful to the FDA, but would be important in this discussion. I think if we could collaborate on identifying that, I think that might be very beneficial to the patient community.
Absolutely. And actually, when sickle cell is done, it'll be a great example of this, because between the real-world database we were able to cobble together and a survey that SickCells was able to do, we were able to fill in some important gaps that weren't in the clinical trials, like how many days do patients suffer from pain with one of their sickle cell crises. Surprisingly not in the clinical data. So we try to identify that as early as possible, obviously, because we want to see if we can turn it around. But that's part of our thinking with our patient engagement program. Maybe there are opportunities to meet, especially with some of the umbrella groups in areas where we're likely to see more new drugs over time. Maybe we can think way ahead of time and think of ways to get data that we know are going to have a role in our model, whereas they wouldn't ever, as you said, have a specific spot in the FDA template.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to give you both one last question as we come to the end of our time, and that is, what would you consider to be a short-term and long-term success metric moving forward?
Sarah, you get to go first this time.
Thanks, Steve. No. So I think that one of the things that we have always strived for with our patient engagement from the very beginning was a sense of understanding at the end of the process. And it didn't have to be agreement. It didn't have to be that you loved the final conclusions, but we strove to have our patient partners feel respected and heard and understood. And so long-term and short-term, that needs to continue, and I want more of those. I want that to be the experience that patient groups have during an ICER process. Short-term, and with the leadership of the vice president, we don't want there to be any surprises for any patient groups that engage with us. And it bums us out when that still seems to happen, that, my team's done their best to, have the patient engagement guide and go through everything. And then we still hear, oh gosh, I didn't know I was supposed to do, or I had the opportunity to do this. I think with somebody whose job full-time is to make sure that any process change, anything that happens throughout the review is staying focused on how it impacts the patient. If we have fewer surprises from the patient groups we work with, I would consider that success.
I had all that time to think of something brilliant to say, and Sarah was very, very good. I've always felt that this is going to be a long march, it's a long march because it involves some of the hardest discussions and decisions that are made in any healthcare system, in any society. How do we make hard choices? How do we reconfigure our healthcare system in a way that maximizes what we want to get out of it? And that requires this kind of shared, almost, I'll say, a communal view of what we're after here. And I think we do share that, but so I guess success for me would be a willingness to view this as a common march through time, so that if we do it right, we get it right, we really will achieve what we are going to consider fair pricing, fair access, and future innovation. Those aren't just kind of made up words. I really hope over time, success to me would be that people feel like, even though it's not going to be tomorrow, that we want to keep pushing this direction, because without evidence, without public discussion, this all just goes back into the back rooms of payers and manufacturers, and ultimately we as individual patients and our families will not be the better off for it. So I guess that's my hope.
With that, I want to thank you, Steve and Sarah, for taking the time to work with us to make these changes, and look forward to continued collaboration as we navigate these new waters. Thank you all.